Hello everyone and welcome to my Soap Twist 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Brooke Logan sat alone in the dimly lighted living room of her vast Los Angeles estate, the weight of the day weighing on her like a smothering cloud. The faint hum of the metropolis beyond her window seemed distant, as if the world had receded, leaving her alone in a sea of her own thoughts. Her hands trembled as she held a glass of wine, the rich red liquid untouched, its surface mirroring the flicker of a single candle on the coffee table. The silence was terrible, interrupted only by the echo of her own heartbeat, which pounded in her ears like a drum. She couldn't get rid of the vision that had burned itself into her memory earlier that day, and sight that had wrecked her world in an instant. It began as a regular morning at Forrester Creations, the fashion business where Brooke had spent decades establishing her legacy. The workplace was buzzing with the typical chaos, designers drawing feverishly, models parading down impromptu runways, and phones ringing nonstop. Brooke had been in her element, overseeing a new collection that was destined to transform the business. Ridge Forrester, her on-again, off-again love, husband and soulmate, had remained by her side, his presence as consistent as ever. Or so she thought. Their partnership had been through many storms, betrayals, misunderstandings, rivalries, but they had always found their way back to each other. Brooke assumed, perhaps stupidly, that this time was different. This time, they were unbreakable. But then came a moment that altered everything. Brooke sneaked into the design studio late in the day to retrieve a misplaced sketchbook. The room was quiet. The usual flurry of activity had ceased as most of the personnel had gone for a late lunch. She had not expected to find anyone there, let alone Ridge. But there he was, in the far corner of the room, his big shoulders visible even in the mild light that filtered through the windows. And he was not alone. A young model in her early 20s stood too near to him. Her name was Lila, and she was a fresh face at Forrester, with sharp cheekbones and wide, innocent eyes that belied her crafty ambition. Brooke paused, her breath stopping in her throat as she watched Lila lean in and brush Ridge's arm. Brooke felt a shiver run down her spine as he laughed quietly. She wanted to turn away and pretend she hadn't noticed, but her feet felt stuck to the ground. Then something happened. Lila tilted her head, and Ridge, her Ridge, leaned down to kiss her. It wasn't a brief peck, but a deep, thoughtful kiss that conveyed intimacy and secrets shared behind closed doors. Brooke's world tilted. The notebook dropped from her grasp, landing on the floor with a heavy thud. Ridge's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers across the room. For a brief period, time seemed to stop. His normally serene features flashed with shame and dread. Lila stepped back, her look unclear, but Brooke was unconcerned about her. Her gaze was fixated on Ridge, the guy she had loved for the majority of her life and who had promised her forever. Without saying anything, she turned and went, her heels clicking on the glossy floor as she hurried away from the studio, the truth and the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. Hours later, she remained in her darkened home, replaying the scenario over and over. Every time, it cut deeper, like a knife twisting in her chest. How could he accomplish this? After everything they had gone through, after all the promises, pledges, tears shed, and battles fought, could they be together? Brooke had always known Ridge was a passionate guy drawn to beauty and intensity, but she had mistakenly assumed, foolishly, she now realizes, that his heart belonged solely to her. She had repeatedly forgiven him for his faults and misdeeds. But something felt odd. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a betrayal that cut to the core of who they were. The wine glass trembled in her palm, so she set it down before it spilled. She didn't need booze to numb the ache. It was too intense, too overwhelming. Her mind raced, going from wrath to sorrow to incredulity. She recalled their children, the family they had created together, and the years they had spent managing the turbulence of their surroundings. Forrester Creations was more than just a business. It was their existence, their common ambition. Despite this, Ridge chose to shatter her heart in that same location, surrounded by the designs they had created together. Brooke stood abruptly, pacing the room as her emotions flared. She wanted to yell, hurl something, and confront Ridge, demanding answers. But what could he say? Was it a mistake? Did it mean nothing? She'd heard such excuses before, and they seemed empty today. Brooke tightened her fists as she remembered Lila's arrogant smile. She wasn't stupid enough to think Lila was blameless in this situation. The young model had been orbiting Ridge for weeks, her flirtation subtle but undeniable. Brooke had disregarded it as innocuous, trusting Ridge to see through the deception. How mistaken she had been. Brooke's wrath faded as the night progressed, giving way to a more pernicious emotion, self-doubt. Wasn't she enough? Had she become too old, too familiar, or too predictable for a man like Ridge, whose life had always been marked by fire and spontaneity? She noticed her reflection in the mirror across the room, her blonde hair still bright and her body beautiful, but the wrinkles around her eyes revealed a narrative of years spent battling for love, respect, and her position in a world that frequently judged her harshly. She had always been the brave one, the woman who defied expectations and refused to be defined by her failures. But suddenly, she felt small and vulnerable, as if the whole core of her identity had broken. The phone buzzed on the table, jarring her out of her reverie. Ridge's name appeared on the screen, and her heart lurched. A part of her wanted to respond, to hear his voice, to let him explain. However, another part, which had been burned too many times, knew better. She let the call go to voicemail and flipped the phone face down. She couldn't face him yet, not with the wound so fresh and her emotions jumbled in love and hate. Brooke slid into the couch, drawing her knees to her chest. The memories came unbidden, moments of joy with Ridge, stolen kisses in the early days, the way he smiled at her as they stood at the altar, swearing to love each other no matter what. Those memories felt like a terrible joke now, tinged with the reality of his betrayal. She remembered the other women who had come before Lila, Taylor, Quinn, and Shauna, and how each time, she struggled to restore her position in Ridge's heart. But this time, she wasn't sure she had enough strength to fight. Not when the agony felt so definitive and absolute. The clock had passed midnight, but Brooke still couldn't sleep. Her head was filled with questions she didn't want to answer. What would happen to Forrester Creations if she and Ridge couldn't cooperate? What would happen to their families? To her, she had always been defined by her feelings for Ridge, by the ups and downs of their tangled, passionate relationship. Without it, who was she? Brooke made a decision as morning broke and a weak light shone through the windows. She couldn't remain in this limbo, torn between love and betrayal. She needed to take control and figure out how to move forward, even if it meant letting go of the man she had loved for so long. She got up from the couch, her movements slow but purposeful, and walked to her workstation. She took up a notepad and began to compose a letter to Ridge, expressing her pain, fury, and heartbreak. She had no idea if she would ever send it, but the act of writing felt like a release, a way to recover a part of herself. The emotions came, raw and unedited, as she detailed seeing him with Lila and how it broke her trust and optimism. She wrote about the years they spent together, the love that defined her existence, and the crushing weight of his treachery. With each syllable, Brooke felt a resurgence of her former power, the fire that had always propelled her to fight for what she believed in. She wasn't ready to forgive just yet, but she was prepared to accept the truth and address the grief head-on. When she finished, the sun had fully risen, bathing the room in warm, golden light. Brooke put down the pen and stared at the pages covered with her writing. They were proof of her survival, a reminder that she was more than Ridge's wife, more than the scandals that had shaped her life. Brooke Logan was a woman who had experienced heartbreak before and emerged stronger. She wasn't sure what the future held, whether she'd fight for Ridge or let him go, whether she'd stay at Forrester Creations or forge her own path. But, for the first time since that tragic moment in the studio, Brooke felt a glimmer of optimism. The road ahead would be difficult and uncertain, but she would walk it with confidence. Brooke knew that no matter what Ridge had done or how severely he had injured her, she was not broken. Not yet. Not ever. Brooke's world always appeared fragile, as if it were held together by strings so thin that even a minor earthquake could cause them to unravel. For years, she had revolved her existence around Ridge, the guy she saw as her destiny, the only constant in a sea of betrayals, reconciliations, and bitter memories. She believed she had faced every test of devotion and love that could possibly exist. But nothing could have prepared her for the day she strolled into the studio unexpectedly and found him, Ridge, the man who had sworn that she was his heart, entangled with a young model, his hands on someone other than her, his voice speaking words she previously thought belonged only to her. Brooke was unable to breathe for a little moment. The environment appeared to tilt, the colors moving as if her vision had been painted with water and the brush had spilled across the painting. When Brooke's shadow fell across the room, the young woman, scarcely more than a girl, looked surprised. Her hair was like spun gold, and her complexion had the sheen of someone who had never known heartbreak. Ridge froze, his face sinking into a mask of remorse. But it was too late. Brooke's memory was carved with fire and no apologies could erase it. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. Instead, something inside her snapped silently, a fracture so deep that she couldn't detect it right away. She turned and walked away, her heels leaving harsh, empty echoes on the floor, each stride bringing her further away from the delusion she had clung to for years. Ridge called her name behind her, his voice full of desperation, but she didn't turn around. She could not. That night, the mansion felt more empty than ever. Every photograph appeared to mock her, depicting smiles, hugs, and promises frozen in time. She moved from room to room, her hands brushing against furniture, walls, and frames, looking for an anchor, but only finding ghosts of brighter times. She poured herself a glass of wine, then another, but the flavor became bitter in her mouth. Even the gentle glow of the hearth felt harsh, emphasizing her loneliness rather than comforting it. Her memory repeated the image incessantly, like a horrible film she couldn't turn off. She attempted to come up with explanations, excuses, and reasons. Perhaps it wasn't as bad as it appeared. Maybe Ridge had only lost his path for a moment. But the truth was apparent. She'd seen him kiss her and let his hands linger with familiarity. Worse than the betrayal itself was the reminder it served. She had always been replaceable in his eyes. Every time she fought for his love or forgave him, she persuaded herself it was because they were meant to be together. Now she realized the truth. Perhaps she had just been convenient until someone younger, fresher, and newer came along. Days passed, yet they blended together in a cloud of misery. Brooke avoided everyone. She ignored phone calls, skipped family dinners, and shut out the world. Hope attempted to contact her, and her children knocked on her door, but she insisted she was well. She masked her sorrow with stillness, persuading herself that if she remained still long enough, the wound would heal itself. But instead, it festered, becoming deeper and heavier. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror, analyzing the creases at the corners of her eyes and the faint softness in her skin that hadn't been there 10 years previously. She remembered Ridge telling her she was timeless and her beauty was immortal. But now all she saw was a woman who had given too much of herself, sacrificing bits of her soul for love that would never last. She clasped her hands to the glass, her reflection distorted by her sobs, and said, "Who am I without him?" The query resonated in the silence, unanswered. Her thoughts began to turn dark and menacing. If Ridge could betray her so easily, what was the sense of clinging to anything? What was the point of believing in love, anyway? Every memory of their love, every pledge made under the stars, seemed poison today. She couldn't recall hearing his laughter without feeling a pang of anguish. It was as if the world had changed overnight, leaving her adrift in a place where nothing felt familiar. Ridge knocked at her house unannounced, pleading to explain, and that was the breaking point. He stood in the rain, his hair wet and his voice hoarse, pleading, but Brooke couldn't force herself to listen. She opened the door just enough to look at him, her eyes empty and her lips shaking, and muttered, "You've destroyed me." Then she slammed it again, sealing herself in, leaving Ridge standing in the storm like a man who had lost everything. Brooke slumped to the floor, sobbing like if they had been waiting for days to flee. She yelled into the empty house, her voice breaking to the point where she couldn't breathe. In that moment, she was not Brooke Logan, the woman everyone admired, envied, or judged. She was just a broken heart, a soul unraveling. The days that followed were darker. She started driving aimlessly, staring at the ocean for hours while waves broke against the shore. The sea felt like her heart, restless, violent, and impossible to soothe. People around her were frightened, but she ignored them, hiding behind delicate smiles. However, when she went home at night, she would sit alone with a glass of wine and the weight of her thoughts, which grew heavier with each passing hour. Sleep abandoned her. Food lost its taste. The walls of her house appeared to close in on her as memories flooded her in waves. She remembered their first kiss, their first wedding, and how Ridge had swore no one else could ever come between them. She remembered the anguish of his betrayals, the reconciliations, and the cycle that had continued until she thought it was unbreakable. Now she wondered if she had always been a fool. Her sadness became sharper. Anger flared, not only at Ridge, but also at herself for believing, forgiving, and hoping when she should have walked away years before. She reflected on all the opportunities she had given him, all the times she had remained by his side, even when he did not deserve it. And now she was discarded like a lost memory, forced to doubt her worth. Brooke stood on her balcony late at night, marveling at the city lights. The air was cold and carried a subtle aroma of jasmine from the garden below. She considered how simple it would be to let go, stop fighting, and fall into the silence that seemed to invite her. But then she remembered her children, grandchildren, and the people who still loved her despite her inability to love herself. The thought kept her standing there until dawn, when the sky lightened to gold and pink. In that weak light, she realized something. Ridge may have broken her, but he couldn't define her. For years, she had lived as if her life depended on his love, but perhaps this devastation was her opportunity to start over. The journey would not be easy. Her heart ached, her trust had been shattered, and her spirit was damaged beyond recognition. But she was still present. She still breathed. The tears didn't stop that morning or the next. But, with each passing day, she began to gather small bits of herself. She began wandering through the yard, letting the sun touch her skin. She contacted Hope and spent hours simply listening to her voice. She let herself remember laughter, even if it ached. The anguish remained acute, but it no longer overwhelmed her completely. It became something she carried, a scar she'd always have, but one that didn't have to kill her. Ridge kept trying, leaving notes, bringing flowers, and appealing for forgiveness, but Brooke would not respond. Not because she didn't love him, the love was still there, tenacious and persistent, but because she realized that love alone was insufficient. She deserved more than a man who would break her trust, or a cycle of betrayal and forgiveness. She needed serenity, even if it meant remaining alone. Brooke chose silence. She picked the distance. She chose to let Ridge bear the weight of his decisions while she pushed herself toward something new. Her voyage had only just begun, yet the melancholy clung to her like a shadow. But somewhere deep inside, despite the pain and rage, a spark remained, the spark of a woman who had been broken many times but had always found a way to rise again. This time would not be different. Her heart might never be the same, but it would still beat. Her spirit might be scarred, but it will always reach for the light. Even though the nights echoed with loneliness, the mornings would arrive, each one affording her a chance to start again. Finally, Brooke's story was about more than simply sorrow and betrayal. It was about survival, the quiet, sad, unglamorous survival of a woman who had loved too much, wounded too profoundly, and refused to fade away into the darkness. Even as she stood by her window, watching the sun rise over the city that had witnessed her greatest joys and worst tragedies, she said to herself words she wasn't sure she believed but desperately needed to hear. "I will be okay.